ahead and kick off, everyone. Welcome for joining. We may have more join us as we go in progress, but I'm Isaac Garcia from Retrium, and you have joined Blaming and Naming, Recognizing and Avoiding Retrospective Anti-Patterns. We're so excited to host this webinar. We have Dr. Aino Corry here to join us. Literally wrote the book on retrospective anti-patterns, or wrote a book on retrospective anti-patterns, and she's about to be sharing with us. But I do want to stop for a second to say I really appreciate our co-presenter of this is the Agile Alliance. We want to say thank you to them for being a co-presenter of it. And we will be recording this. And so that recording will be available at the same place you registered for this webinar on the website. There's a blog at retrium.com, and you'll be able to find the recording available afterwards. And so as we go forward, we will be having some time for question and answers at the end. Inside of Zoom, there's a question and answer box. You can use that to pop it open and put in any questions you have. Also keep an eye on that. Even if you don't have questions, you can upvote and downvote questions of, hey, that's something I want to know. You can upvote it so that we can use those at the end. So we're going to have a great time together here. We've got about an hour blocked. And so we're, again, so glad that you're joining us. And Dr. Corry, I'm just so thrilled that you're here with us. And I am really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us about not naming and blaming, but about understanding retrospective anti-patterns. So I just want to say a big thank you, and we'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Isaac, for having me here. Yes, so yes, I literally wrote a book about retrospective anti-patterns, and it took me 7 years, which I guess is an anti-pattern in itself. I've been interested in retrospectives for about 15 years and facilitating retrospectives for a number of years. And I made all the mistakes you can possibly make facilitating retrospectives, and that's why I decided to write down my experiences in a way that other people could get use of. But I'd like to know a little bit more about you before I start. So we prepared a poll, and I hope that you will join me in voting in this poll so that I can see who I'm talking to.
Yeah, so we'll launch that poll out there. Excellent.
So I just want to know whether you're very experienced in facilitating retrospectives, whether you're just a little bit experienced, whether you've not facilitated but attended, or whether you just showed up for this webinar because you're curious and don't know what retrospectives is about. Just so that I know how much time I should spend on the different aspects of retrospectives. And I guess people have had time to vote now. So I'm curious to see who you are. Yep, as I expected. 78% of you have facilitated many retrospectives. That's why you're here, I guess. 16% have facilitated 1 or 2 retrospectives, 5% have only attended retrospectives, and 1% is here because they're curious about what this is. And welcome to that person. It's great to have you here. I'll try to feed your curiosity. So let's start the presentation. Now, I did a PhD in design patterns for software design back in the last century or the last millennia. And I became very interested in patterns and later on anti-patterns. So I want to explain to you what anti-patterns is before we start, because some people say that it's a very negative thing. But before we start to talk about anti-patterns, I'd like to tell you something else. So some of you might recognize what this is. This is hell. It's very warm, there's the internal fire, it's terrible, right? I don't know if any of you know what this is. This is Niflheim. This is the Scandinavian hell. In the Scandinavian hell, it's very cold and damp and it's raining. And you get into Niflheim, the Scandinavian hell, if you don't kill in an honorable way. So if you're a murderer, you can still go not in hell, but you go to hell if you haven't killed in a good way, right? So that's something to think about if you ever go to Scandinavia. And just forget about those for a minute, and we'll go back to what is a pattern and what's an anti-pattern. So a pattern is, as I say, a literary form to pass on experience. So you have the context and forces, you have what they say an often occurring problem, and then you have a pattern solution, which is a solution which is abstracted away from all different implementations. This is the way to do things. And of course, this solution has some benefits, some negative consequences, and some related solutions. So that's the pattern as we know it and love it. Now, an anti-pattern is almost like a pattern, but there's a little bit more added to it. So it has context and forces. So it has the problem domain you're in, and then it has an anti-pattern solution, which is a solution that people often apply to this problem. But it turns out to be an anti-pattern solution and not a pattern solution, because the symptoms and consequences are more negative than positive. And when you find yourself in an anti-pattern solution with more negative consequences, then you have the refactored solution. And that is what I have in the book. I have the refactored solution to the anti-patterns that you will run into when you facilitate retrospectives. Of course, that has benefits and negative consequences as well. Let me give you an example. So back in the old days, people weren't behaving very well, and it was very difficult to get them to behave very well, right? So you had the problem domain that people weren't being nice to each other. So you invented hell. And hell then meant that people wanted to behave well because they didn't want to go to hell. And that really worked very well. Now, one of the differences between a pattern and an anti-pattern can be the different time or the different context it's in. Of course, the anti-pattern solution is what you thought was a good idea at the time with what you knew at the time. That's why you did it. But then the context changes. It's another team, it's another situation, other resources, and then things change, right? So for instance, if you take that hell, the very hot hell, and you tell Scandinavian people, if you don't behave well, you go to this very, very warm place, the Scandinavian people will say, oh, great, we'll be on the beach and we'll have nice drinks and it'll be lovely. So we'll just pillage and murder and rape people. And maybe that's why we did what we did. But then the refactored solution is, of course, to solve this problem and to find a solution which will help us get the right consequences. So we decided to have a very cold and damp hell, which means we don't want to go there because that's what it is in Scandinavia. So that's sort of in a nutshell, the difference between a pattern and an anti-pattern is the context and the time. And just to recap really quickly what a retrospective is. I know most of you know what a retrospective is, but I'd like us to be on the same page. So I'll just go through very shortly. I say that to me, a retrospective is about sharing what has happened, share the experiences, share the incidents, and understanding what happened, understanding why things happened, understanding how we got into that situation, understanding how come people did what they did, and then appreciating each other. I think it's a very important thing. A very important part about retrospectives is also appreciating the positive things, appreciating each other's, giving compliments, because if you learn to do that, maybe you'll do that on a daily basis as well. And then to learn, which is, I think, the most important thing that people talk about with retrospectives. How can we learn from the things that happens? How can we improve what we're doing? And then, as my late father said, to understand everything is to forgive everything. So that understanding that you get from a retrospective where you share and you understand, that helps you forgive things that perhaps weren't as good as you thought they would be. So to introduce the anti-patterns for retrospectives, I have a little example here. I have a Danish company called Titanic A that makes reliable navigational software, but it has some problems with some of the ships. It's not going very well. They're going to the wrong places and they're crashing into icebergs and things like that. So what do? Well, the IT department that makes this navigational software, they all go on a Scrum course. They all become Scrum Master certified, and then they need to start doing Scrum in an agile way, because that will be the solution to everything, as we know. And Sarah is the one who's most eager to become a Scrum Master, so she becomes a Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is the one facilitating the retrospectives. That's what we all hear. So she will be facilitating the first retrospective. Now, the first retrospective anti-pattern is called Prime Directive Ignorance. And Prime Directive Ignorance is the situation you're in, which you as a facilitator is ignoring the prime directive that Norm Kurth wrote about everybody did the best they did. And then you end in a situation like this poor little fish here, where everybody's just pointing, naming, and blaming on that fish. So what she hears happening, Sarah, in week 2 at the first retrospective, is Peter is not doing what he should. The team had been very, very busy and they've been working very hard. But Peter is not pulling his weight. He's leaving early, he's arriving late, and there's a lot of post-it notes in the retrospective about this, and in the end, Peter leaves the room. Everybody knew before the retrospective started that it was Peter's fault that they didn't make the deadline because they were busy and he wasn't pulling his weight. So what they didn't think about was this prime directive that Norm Kurth wrote when he wrote the book Project Retrospectives, which is, regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could, given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. Now, the problem with that prime directive is that it is really hard to understand and truly believe that everybody did the best. Because we know that some people are slacking. We know some people are being lazy. We know that we ourselves aren't always doing our best because we're thinking about other things. We're focused on other things. We're not really spending the energy that we should. So it's very, very difficult to really believe this. But what Norm Kurth tried to do was to say, well, this is a mindset that you should strive to have when you enter a retrospective. Because if you strive to have that mindset, if you go to the room and you're thinking everybody actually did the best they could given what they knew at the time, then Sarah in her retrospective might not have had that big problems with Peter being very sad and leaving the room, because they wouldn't have pointed fingers at him. They would have thought he did the best he could with the resources available. And then perhaps they would have an understanding about, how did we end in this situation? How could we have supported Peter in a way that would have helped him do what he could? Maybe they would have learned that he has some problems in his private life that makes it difficult for him to focus on the work, but at least they wouldn't have attacked him like they did. And they would have learned a little bit more about how they as a team, as a system, could learn from this. So the refactored solution, as I said, there was in the antipattern, the refactored solution for the prime directive ignorance is not to ignore it. That's a short version. Bring the prime directive to the retrospective room. You can put it on a whiteboard, you can write it on a poster, you can bring that poster. If you have an online retrospective, you can write it in an email the day before. And if you think that the wording of the prime directive is a bit weird, you can just say it in your own words. I have some teams that like the wording of that. I have other teams that think it's just too posh. So they just need me to remind them, remember, we're trying to find faults in the system and not in singular people here. So we're trying to figure out what happened and what can we learn from that. And then along the lines of a retrospective, even if you said it in the beginning and it's in an email, sometimes you have to remind people that need it. And sometimes you have to remind yourself that sometimes things go not as you planned it at a retrospective, and you might blame yourself that you're stupid or you're bad, but remind yourself that the prime directive works for you as a facilitator yourself, and forgive yourself for what's happening because you did your best. Of course you did. Why wouldn't you? So this is a picture that is illustrating the prime directive ignorance. Now the next anti-pattern that I'll go through 5 anti-patterns with you, is the Wheel of Fortune. And the Wheel of Fortune, what you should imagine when I'm talking about the Wheel of Fortune is you're in the Tivoli and you have that Wheel of Fortune and you're making that Wheel of Fortune go round and round and round, and then it stops and perhaps you get a prize and perhaps you don't get a prize. And it reminds me a little bit about the kinds of retrospectives where you say, let's start doing this, let's stop doing this, let's continue doing that. And then sometimes it's a bit more detail and it's less of and more of as well. But let's imagine that Sarah is facilitating a retrospective with these, let's do more of, let's do less of, let's start, stop, continue. So she gets some post-it notes from the team members saying, let's have more of the pair programming, let's have less meetings, and let's stop ignoring pull requests. And then there's a lot of retrospective facilitators that say, well, this is great, we have the solutions right now, and people want to go back to the real world, so they want to end the retrospective early. I mean, if we can just get it over, have a short and snappy retrospective, that'd be great. So we'll just do more pair programming, less meetings, and stop ignoring the pull requests. Easy. The problem is that sometimes these things that you see are just the symptoms and not the actual problems. So it could be that the reason why you don't have more pair programming is not because you haven't just said do more pair programming. I mean, there could be different things. It could be that the technical setup they have for doing pair programming is not really satisfactory. It could be that there's a huge difference in what skill level the people in the team are, and the people who are novices are afraid to show the experts that they're not as good as they want to be. It could also be that the experts think that if they can just work on their own in a known little silo, they can work much faster and it's much better for everybody else. And it could also be that there's lack of trust in the team, that people feel insecure about showing the way that they program or the way that they design to other people in the team. And if those are the reasons, if it's not just because they've forgotten to do more pair programming, then perhaps those are the things that you should work on the trust, work on people accepting that some are novices and some are experts, work on experts to understand that the truck number should be lower and that other people should learn from their expertise. But the point is, with retrospectives, if we go through what a retrospective is, it consists of 5 different parts, and they're all 5 really, really important. And there's one of those 5 that people often just jump over, and I'll explain that in a moment. So the first part of a retrospective is setting the stage, getting ready, maybe making everybody say something so that they feel able to say something later. Then we gather data. This is a thing that's, I think, to me, is the easiest part of retrospective, is just to get the post-it notes up there, look at the burn down chart or the regression tests or something like that. Gathering the data is easy. Generating insights is the difficult part. In a sense, you have to sort of stop people from jumping to the solutions and make them spend some time looking at how did we end up in this situation? What are the causes behind people ignoring the pull requests? What are the causes behind people wanting less meetings? Is it because the meetings are too long? Is it because they're invited to the wrong meetings? What is the reasons actually? Because just saying no meetings is probably not going to solve the underlying problem. So generating insights is really important. And if you lose that, then you'll see the Groundhog Day retrospectives where the same thing pops up again and again because it's not solved. It's like having skin cancer and you put a product on it. It might look better for a few days, but the skin cancer is still there. It'll pop up. And then decide what to do is normally the time, at least if you're working with people in software, where they sort of, there's a relieved tension in the room where finally we can talk about solutions, finally we can talk about what we should do now, because these people, our people, are very good at finding solutions to problems. Like when they see a problem, they have a solution. That's a problem also when you gather the data. You sometimes see the post-it notes, which should be about data and things that happen, are actually already, I think we should do this instead, or shouldn't we try this? So it already looks like solutions, and that's a thing to be wary of as well. And then the end, closing the retrospective, really important part, where you say, well, these experiments that we decided to try out, or the action points that we decided to do, who's responsible for making sure it happens? Doesn't necessarily have to be the person who does it all, but it has to be somebody who takes the responsibility for making it happen, so that we can talk about it at the next retrospective and see if it worked out or if it didn't work out. So let's just dwell on the generating insights a bit. So the generating insights is about finding the causes behind the problems. And there are different activities that you can do there. There's the fishbone here, the Escanaba diagram that some of you might have seen, where the problem is the head, and then different types of causes are the ribs of the fish, where you can invite people to put post-it notes on these ribs to see what kind of problems are we dealing with here, what is actually the things that we should change. There's also the 5 whys that a lot of people use, asking why did this happen and why did this happen. There's been a lot of controversy about the 5 whys lately, because people are saying 2 things. The one thing is that if you're just using 5 whys, then sometimes you drill into having one cause behind a very complicated problem. And if you really believe that this complicated problem only has one cause, that's a bit simplistic. So you could use the Escanaba diagram instead. And the other thing people are saying against the whys is that if you're asking people, why did this happen? Why did you do that? Then sometimes the only answer they can come up with is, well, apparently I was an idiot, right? It's like asking my husband, why did you drop your towel on the floor again? And the only answer he can say is, because I'm an idiot, apparently, right? Not that he ever does that, but it's, you know what I mean, right? So some people are saying, let's talk about 5 hows instead. How did we end up in this situation? How did this happen? How could we have done this differently? And I think that opens up for more interpretation, which is not necessarily about blaming. And the picture for that is the cute little octopus doing the Wheel of Fortune. The reason why it's an octopus is because I really love octopuses. So yeah, anyway, not so important. The next retrospective antipattern is do it yourself, and you can see the octopus here playing cards with itself. And so this is because there's a lot of, if you look up who should facilitate a retrospective, it often says it's the Scrum Master who should facilitate the retrospective. The Scrum Master of the team, it's their responsibility to facilitate the retrospective. And in a sense, I understand why that could be correct. But you'll sometimes end up in things like this, where you hear the team member saying the retrospectives are boring, they're a waste of time, we should have a better facilitator. But actually, you sometimes hear the facilitator or the Scrum Master themselves say, I would like to get something out of them as well. And so the problem is that if you are the Scrum Master, you're part of the team and you want to take part in the retrospective as well. The retrospective is a team building exercise where the team learns together. And if you're the facilitator, you can't take part in the voting, you can't take part in the brainstorming, can't take part in the discussions, because if you do take part in all that, you forget about your facilitator role. And the facilitator role is about making sure that you're not going over time, looking at the body language of the people. If you're together in the room, it's easy to see who are standing close to who, whose feet are pointing towards who, where is the attention. If it's online, it's a bit more difficult. You have to look at the faces to see, does anybody want to say something? Or is somebody getting really mad about something? Or is somebody just going out of the retrospective? So using that body language is important. And that's why you have to be really alert as a facilitator. It's a full-time job. And you also have to think about, okay, this needs a little bit longer discussion. So if I take that out of the agenda, maybe we can have a little bit more time on that, or maybe I should tell them to stop the discussion and take it at a different time. All these things you have to think about as a facilitator, and you can't do that while you're also being part of the discussions. So I like to use this picture for a do-it-yourself retrospective. It doesn't necessarily mean that you always fail. There's a lot of people who do it very well, but it's just difficult, right? So one of the things that I tried in one of the companies I worked for is that we have this facilitator rotation. So it was a big software company where I was facilitating for my own team, but I found it really irritating that I should facilitate for my own team for the reasons I came up with before. And I knew some of the other Scrum Masters were facilitating for their teams. And then we decided that we should simply rotate that. And we could do it because it was a big company. So we just had a shared document where all the teams that wanted to have a facilitator from a different team said, we want a retrospective at this date and this date. And the people who wanted to facilitate could suggest that they could facilitate different retrospectives. Some teams wanted the same facilitator all the time. Some teams wanted a new facilitator. Some teams had certain facilitators that didn't want because of chemistry, but those are all things that you find out. Of course, you can have an external facilitator coming from outside. I'm facilitating for different companies now as an external facilitator, where I facilitate either every iteration retrospective or every 3 months. Another thing that I normally tell people is, if you're a novice in facilitating, like if other people in the company needs to learn how to facilitate, a system like Retrospective actually can help you a lot. As you can see in this picture, there's sort of midways in the retrospective, you're voting on the different things that people came up with. And then there's helpful little information boxes that will help a novice facilitator learn, what are we doing right now? Okay, we're voting anonymously so that people won't get biased, and have this number of votes for each step of the process. So something like Retrospective will really help a novice facilitator. So that's do it yourself. And now you can see why it was important that the octopus was playing cards with itself. The next one is Disregard of Preparation. And Disregard of Preparation is one that's about online retrospectives. So you can see the poor octopus here trying to facilitate an online retrospective where people are doing whatever they want. So the octopus is trying to say, we're here now, we're here in the retrospective process, and people just playing ball or small talking or drinking coffee or finding oyster pills or something like that. So this is about online retrospectives. And sometimes when you start an online retrospective, you hear people say, oh, is the retrospective now? I hadn't noticed. Oh God, well, I'll be there in a few minutes. And where's the link again to that shared document? And then if people are sitting in the same room and other people are sitting remotely, you can see that there's small talk between some of the people in the same room that the people who are outside the room can't really be part of. And also I hear this often, did we get a password for this? And did we get a password is interesting, because sometimes people really need a password, but other times it's just something people say, even though they know they don't need a password, just to stall while they're looking through the emails to find the document. So disregard of preparation is definitely an anti-pattern when it comes to online retrospectives. To all retrospectives, you need to prepare, but for online retrospectives, there's so many things you can't just do in the fly. So the refactored solution here is that if you are facilitating an online retrospective, or actually any other big meeting online, send an email the day before. Send an email the day before with a link to the document that they should be able to access, and say, please remember to be able to access this document before we start the meeting, so that you don't have to do it when we start. And then, of course, in maybe the first time, some people will ignore that, but then they'll see at the retrospective or the meeting that other people have actually prepared, and then it's a bit embarrassing that everybody waits for them. So they will learn over time. And send an email 10 to 15 minutes before. I think that works because it seems if you're sitting in an office and you see other people getting up to go to a meeting, then you're reminded that there's a meeting soon, and maybe you'll go get a glass of water, a cup of coffee, go to the toilet. But if you're sitting just in front of your computer, especially now when we're doing it all day, sometimes we forget that we are plants, that we need to hydrate and dehydrate. So send an email a little bit before to remind them to get something to drink, or perhaps having a bio break before. Insist on video for all. This is a bit controversial, I've learned. If you want to facilitate a retrospective, it is very important to be able to see people's body language, so that you can actually facilitate it in a way so that everybody gets heard and nobody is talking all the time. You want this to be a team thing. You don't want people to just pull out of this. If they are pulling out of it, it's a different anti-pattern that I don't think we will have time for here. But then some people say, well, I know you can't insist on people being on video, because there's some people who are uncomfortable being on video. And I appreciate that. And if people are really like personally uncomfortable about being on video, then I think you should let them not be on video. But some of the reasons that I've heard for not being on video, like, I have to take this retrospective from my car. Well, that's, again, then the cause is different, right? The problem is not that you don't want to be on video. The problem is that you're not respecting the retrospective with your team enough. And being in a car taking a retrospective is just not respecting your team. Some people say, I can't be on video because I'm in a coffee bar on the cafe, and I'll be having other people on the video. And again, I don't think it's really an acceptable excuse, again, because the cause is you're not respecting this time with your team, and that's why you're taking it from a cafe. Plus, if you can take it from a cafe, you can just sort of hide the background in most cases, or you can hide your self-view when people are going past you. So I know that there are some people who have real good reasons for not being on video, but I think you should question it at least, and don't do it in front of everybody, like, why are you not on video? But perhaps after the retrospective, say, is there a particular reason why it's difficult to be on video? Is it like the Wi-Fi, or is it other problems? Is there something I can help you with? So make sure everybody's equal. That is regarding the thing I said before with, if some people are together in one room and other people are just sitting like satellites, then the people who are sitting together, they have a large benefit in doing that, because they can small talk together, which makes them feel more like a little group that trust each other, and the others feel like outsiders. But also they can have some communication, not just with words, but actually also with body language, that you can see that people are mirroring the same way they have their hands or their arms, and other people can't see that. And actually just the smell of all the different hormones that we're evaporating shows people whether we are angry or happy or whatever. So that subtle way of communication is something that some people just don't get if you're having some people in one room and other people as satellites. So I try to insist also that if we have like a hybrid online conference like that, or an online retrospective, that everybody should actually be in their own room with their own computer. Now, there's a lot of pushback for that, because they say, well, if we are together, then it's easier just to be in the same room and share a computer and things like that. And I say, yes, I completely understand how convenient it is for you. But I want you to understand how inconvenient it is for the poor people who cannot be here. And they will miss out on things, definitely. So making everybody equal is very important. And if there's one person who is a satellite and who has chosen to be a satellite because they want to work from a different country, then you can say, well, maybe the rest of the team can actually have an in real life retrospective with post-it notes and everything like that. And then the person who has decided to be outside could have an avatar, which is one of the people in the room who plays them, who puts up post-it notes for them, who reads post-it notes, who maybe take pictures, panorama pictures, or go close to something for them. So they're acting as them. But I wouldn't do it with more than 1 or 2 people not being present. And then for every retrospective, I think it's a good idea to prepare an agenda and an alternative agenda, especially if you're not really, really experienced and can just make one up in a minute. And especially for online retrospectives, because as I mentioned in do-it-yourself retrospectives, sometimes some discussions come up where you can tell, well, we actually need to spend a little bit more time on this before we go on to what caused it. We need to understand this problem first, or we need to understand the causes better before we decide on what to do. And then sometimes you have to change the agenda. Sometimes you have to say, well, okay, time out, this is important. Do you agree with me that we just focus on this for the rest of the retrospective and the other things we'll put in a parking lot for later? Or will you be very sad if we don't get to them? Because right now it seems to me this is important. Or it could be that in the gathered data, you see a lot of stuff which is about another team or about the manager, and then maybe you need to go into a different activity that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So changing the agenda is important to be able to do. But of course, in the beginning as a novice, it's difficult to change the agenda. And that's why I think that the online tools such as Retrium are very good to help you get through the agenda that you decided to do. And then later on, maybe you'll be able to change it. And then don't record it. There's a lot of people who say, well, Peter can't be here today, so we'll just record it for his sake. And what do you think about that? And I say, well, I mean, it could be a good idea, but I want retrospectives to be a place of trust. The things that happen in a retrospective stays in the retrospective. The only thing you take out are the little post-it notes with the experiments or the action items, but what people said and how they sounded when they said it, what they looked like, I don't really want that to get outside. And you know how it is with videos, that they can be shared, and even though people say it's only Peter who's going to see it, some people might not share as much if they know it's recorded on video. So I would definitely need to have a very good reason for recording it. So that was the 4th anti-pattern. I wanted to take you through the disregard of preparation. Now, the last anti-pattern I'd like to talk about before the questions is what I call in the soup. And there's some people who struggle with this illustration, but what I wanted to look like is that the octopus is trying to lift a weight which is too heavy for it, that it cannot lift that weight. It's impossible. It's like the team trying to solve something in a retrospective that the team cannot solve itself. And what you hear sometimes is, oh, the boss will never allow us to do that. And we always discuss the testing framework, and why can't the retrospectives help us? They're just a waste of time and we never get anything changed. And the only thing we talk about is the brand of the coffee in the coffee machine, or how long the stand-up meeting should be. And we go back and forth between 10 minutes and 15 minutes. So that's sometimes what happens with retrospectives. But if you have a big thing that you don't seem to be able to change, maybe you are in the anti-pattern that's called in the soup. And some of you might know this circles and soup activity, or the circles of influence, where you draw 2 circles. The innermost circle is the things that you can do something about. The middle circle is the thing you can influence, and the last one is in the soup. So in Denmark, we have a saying that is, give me coffee to solve my problems, give me red wine to forget the problems I can't solve, and give me the wisdom to know the difference between the coffee and the red wine problems. And that's the same as you have in teams. That sometimes in teams, when you have in the part of the gathering data, you see things that these things are problems because of things that the team does, but sometimes it's just the things that other people do that is affecting this team. So let's look at some examples here. So maybe they say that the communication with the testers is bad, but that's a two-way thing. That's not something that the team can change themselves. They might be able to influence the communication with the testers, but they can't change it because in this team, the testers are not in the team. I know that in a real agile world, the developers are testers and everybody are together, but there's just once in a lifetime, you meet a team where the testers are outside the team. Not in any of your teams, of course, but some teams I've seen. And so that's something that they can only influence. And then there's things that they can do, like code review all major changes. That's something the team can decide to do themselves, and that's something they can do. They're empowered to do that. And then there's things that are in the soup, like change the location of the company. That's not something that the team can do anything about. But the interesting thing is that when you start talking about these things, then sometimes you can actually find shifts here. So you could come up with a reason for having a local hub, and that would mean that you could influence the problem with the location of the company, because maybe you can have a local hub and some people could meet together there. You could also move closer to the testers. That's something that the team could actually do, and in most cases they can decide to do it. I know in some companies they cannot decide where they sit, but in other companies they can decide to sit closer to the testers, and maybe that'll improve the communication. It could also be that what they come up with is, we need to talk to the testers about how to do this. And then maybe the action point of the experiment is that somebody should set up a time to talk to the testers. Now this anti-pattern also shows me that sometimes you need to have more people invited to the retrospective. So in general, I say that the people you invite to retrospective is the team themselves, together with perhaps the product owner or the enablers, that they have the architects or the testers or whatever. But you don't have the managers in the retrospectives. My rule of thumb is, if you can hire or fire, you shouldn't be in the retrospective, because it can make some people uneasy. I know, of course, that there's some, like especially startups, where the manager is part of the team, and then of course he or she should be part of the retrospective. But if you see a retrospective and it's recurring in the retrospectives that there are some things in the soup that only the manager can do something about, then maybe it could be worthwhile to actually invite the manager there and say, well, these things we'd like to have a retrospective with you about, because, well, we could also have just a normal discussion about it, but a retrospective just allows for a more opening about what could the causes behind this be, instead of just having a problem that we know, which is what the problem is, that we need to solve it. So sometimes inviting more people is the result of making these circles and influence. Another thing that I use this for is that sometimes I'm with a team, and it's often a team that has been used to work in sort of the old ways, and now they've been transformed to a more agile way, where the leaders are supporters instead of management leaders like they used to be. But these people have been trained in, it's somebody else's fault. So if I notice a team where I feel like they're not taking responsibility for the issues, then after they gather data, then I say, okay, now take all your post-it notes and put them in this circle and influence. And then if everything is in the soup, then I ask them to look at it and say, what do you see here? Just to make them put up a mirror in front of them and say, are you aware that all your problems are somebody else's fault, and it's not even within your circle of influence? And then sometimes they say, okay, well, you're right. And sometimes I say, well, the things in the soup, could you make it worse? Because if they notice they can actually make it worse, then it is in their circle of influence. And then perhaps they need to pull it a little bit closer to the center, because if they have any influence, then they can have positive influence as well. So I use that a lot for that. And I also use it for later in the retrospective sometimes. I don't use it twice in the same retrospective, but sometimes later in the retrospective, when they've brainstormed about things to do, like, all these experiments we could do, all these things we want to change. And then you know that there's like 19 things they want to do. And then you say, you can choose 2. And then they react like, we want all of them and we'll forget them. And they're all so great. And, oh, why do you only let us make 2? And I say, well, you know, you can make all you want, But at the next retrospective, all I'll ask you about are these two. And if you haven't focused on those two, then chances are it probably won't happen. If you're focusing on 19 different changes at the same time, it won't happen. And one thing to do there, if there are all these suggestions for changes, it's actually to make the soup exercise again. And then take all these things that they want to do and put them in those circles and see, well, we can actually only choose the ones that you can do something about. We could choose to try to influence the things in the influence, but the things in the soup, well, you just have to learn to live with it, or you have to invite some other people into this so that our circle of influence becomes bigger. So I like to use the soup exercise in the end as well, if they have all these different things they want to do, just to make them realize again that maybe only some of them can be done by them. So that was in the soup. And then all this is just, of course, to make you buy my book. So I hope you'll do that. But I have another poll before we start with the questions that I'd like to hear about these different antipatterns, how often you have sort of run into these antipatterns. So these 5 antipatterns, which of them have you seen most often? I'll just give you a moment while I drink some water to vote. I think, have we reached a positive number of votes now? Could we look at the results?
Yeah, we've got about 70% response, which is pretty good response.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
And I hope the remaining 30% have a very good nap, because that's important. Naps are underrated. So, that's interesting. Okay, so it's actually, like, I would say almost the same number. So thank you very much for your input. That was very interesting for me to see. Right, and then I think that I would like to answer questions if there are any questions. Is there any questions, Isaac?
Yeah, there are. Yes, we had some come in, and just a reminder to everyone that you can still ask a question, also upvote the questions that you're interested in hearing an answer to. We had a couple that bubbled well to the top that we'll start with those that people were most interested to hear. So the first one is, how would you deal with cases when people have no interest to improve in retrospectives? They don't believe in their value and they don't even want to talk with you about it. So the doubting disbelievers, how would you handle that?
Oh yeah, doubting disbelievers are lovely. And it's very difficult. Well, I would say that it depends. It depends on whether it's the entire team, whether it's the organization, or whether it's individuals who don't believe in the retrospectives. If it's individuals who don't believe in the retrospectives and the rest of the team are curious and think that they get something out of it, then I'll take a chance to talk to these people between the retrospectives to ask them what they think the problem is, and is it just that they think it's a waste of time to talk about things, or is it something else? Is it because they're uncomfortable talking about these things? Do they only want to talk about code? Because some people are uncomfortable talking about how they feel about things to their colleagues. They only want to talk about like really technical things. Or is it because they've tried retrospectives and they don't think they get anything out of it? And is there anything perhaps they could do to help you improve the retrospective? So sometimes I've been lucky enough that some of the really negative ones, I've had a conversation with them and I told them, well, you're actually, I can tell you're very intelligent. And you are able to see through things that others can't. So you would be very valuable in helping me improve these retrospectives. So if you could help me, perhaps at the next retrospective, discreetly letting me know if the discussion is taking too long, or if you think we're going out at a limit we shouldn't be, or perhaps you could look at the agenda I have for the next retrospective and you can let me know what you think we should do about it. And then sometimes you're lucky that these very negative people feel that now Instead of having you as an enemy, a time-consuming enemy, now they can help you. And then they become part of your team, and they're actually invaluable. And some of these people who are the most negative actually become the most, the best proponents of retrospectives in my experience, because they understand, because they're part of it. It's much like the marriages where you put people together that don't love each other, right? But they can actually, with respect and working with each other and helping each other and making each other happy, they can actually learn to love each other and understand what they get out of it. So that's if it's individuals. Sometimes I've had a team that thinks that it's negative. And if I already have had a lot of retrospective with them, then I can make an exercise where I say, these are all the action points in the past half year that you decided to do all the experiments. So let's look at how many did you actually do and what was the effect. And then hopefully they can see that the effect was good. But they sometimes forget these things. They sometimes forget that the reason why we like going to work is because everybody says good morning to each other, and we decided to do that on a retrospective. Or they forget that the reason why the pull requests are now actually being reacted upon within 24 hours is because we had a retrospective 3 months ago where we decided we wanted to change that process. Now, if they don't see the point whatsoever, that is probably because they don't understand what it can give them. And you can't really sell retrospectives. Nobody wants a retrospective, but a lot of people want a solution to their problem. It's like when we have the agile transformation, nobody wants to be changed, but they like to change. So if they can see the point, then they're more likely willing to do something about it. So perhaps they are doing retrospectives because the management said that they should, or perhaps they're doing retrospectives because now we're doing agile and then you have to do retrospectives. So what you need to do there is either just say, well, we don't do retrospectives, then we do something else, and then do retrospectives without calling them retrospectives. Figure out a way to talk about the problems, figure out a way to look at the causes behind the problems, and figure out a way to find out how to solve these problems, because every team has something that could be improved. So don't call it retrospective, just say that now we're going through these things, and then perhaps you can call it retrospectives after the fact. But I think always asking the why behind things is interesting. And if they don't understand why they should do that, then of course they don't want to do that. And if they're negative in the outset with the retrospective, it will not be a successful retrospective. You won't be able to make them do any activities. They'll just be, And then when you ask them to write post-it notes, they'll be like 1 or 2 post-it notes, and you can't work with that. So I think the first thing is to understand that it's most likely not you who is causing that problem. It's most likely what they feel about retrospectives and maybe their history with retrospectives. So that was a long answer.
Wow. Let me just say, that was a pro answer. Anybody who's having problems with this, I highly recommend you go back and watch the recording and just do what she just said, because from experience, I've experienced several teams and I've seen other teams with those kind of problems. I could not have framed that better. You absolutely laid out a great way to handle what is a thorny problem for a new novice Scrum Master.
Yeah.
No one wants to come.
Yeah.
Really great answer. Thank you for that. So the next one actually ties in with that very well, which is, how do you manage when you're wrapping up a retrospective and you have your action items, but none of the team members are interested in taking responsibility, or the team asks the facilitator, Scrum Master, why don't you do that?
Yeah.
How would you handle that?
Oh yeah, that happens all the time for me. I think it's a Scrum Master who should do that. I think, isn't that what a Scrum Master is for? And I think you have to remind people of the why. So one thing that I always say is that when nobody wants to take responsibility, I say, remember, taking responsibility doesn't mean you have to do all the work. Taking responsibility means that you're responsible for making it happen. It might be somebody else who should do it. So for instance, it could be that, let's take an example. In the daily stand-ups, what we want to do now is, instead of going and asking people what they've done, because then everybody has to say that they've done something, we're going through all the different stories in the board, because then we're not pointing at somebody. We're interested in where the stories are, not whether people have actually worked. Now you take responsibility for doing that, Isaac, and that doesn't mean that you will be the one always going through all the stories. It just means that if somebody is starting to talk about themselves, saying, well, yesterday, blah, 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 you'll say, oh, remember that we're talking through the stories, not through people. And you can also ask for help, even though you're responsible for that. You can say, I feel uncomfortable pointing it out. I tried it these 2 mornings and it doesn't really feel like right. Could somebody else help me the next days? Because we as a team decided this was a good thing to do, so you want to help me do this, right? And then at the next retrospective, I know the scary facilitator will ask Isaac, how did it go with that experiment? And then Isaac is the one saying to me how it went. And he can also say, I had to ask for help from somebody. So that's one thing I want to say. Another thing I want to say is, again, well, the Scrum Master is already doing a lot of work in a team. And what the team decides to try out in a retrospective are experiments that they believe are a good thing to do. And they can definitely take responsibility for doing these things themselves. So there's a lot of teams who think that the only thing I'm responsible for is coding. And that's not true. Because if you're not in a team, if you're not trusting each other, if you don't feel like you can ask for help, if you don't feel like you can say, I'm stuck, then we all know situations where people have sort of gone down a rabbit hole, never to return, and it never, I mean, the code never worked with the rest of the system. It just had to cut that branch off. So we all know, even deeply technical people, that you do need to communicate about things. And that's why you need to have a team. And if you do things for each other as a team, then you become more trustworthy with each other, and then it will be easier for you to ask things. Reliability and relationship is important to build trust in a team.
That's great. And I love that you're focusing on, it's not just, one person, you go do it, the rest of us are going to forget about it until next retrospective, right? Recognizing it is, we decide as a team, this is what we should work on. Who's going to be responsible to help remind us to work on it? I love that. It's not just one person. Your job, go do it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, you're the Scrum Master. What else do you do?
Yeah, exactly. What else do you do?
Things.
Yeah. But a side note to that is, sometimes I hear them say, well, that's a team effort. We'll just do that together, and say, not going to happen. Everybody's responsibility is nobody's responsibility. I need somebody that I can ask next time we have a retrospective, how did it go?
Yeah. Yep. You need that person, the responsible individual who will say, yeah, I'll be responsible this sprint.
My name is on this one. Yeah.
Okay, so the next one, oh yeah, I like it. All right, so the next one actually goes back to something you said in your presentation, and the question was, I've always heard it's important for the retros to be the team own a safe environment. Would having an outside facilitator jeopardize the safe environment?
Yeah, that's a good question, which I think I can answer, because I've been an outside facilitator for about 10 years. And I mean, it's interesting because your immediate response is that people won't open up to an outside facilitator. But actually what I see is the opposite, because they know that if they do well or don't do well, it doesn't really affect whether I get a higher, higher wage, or whether I'll go up in the organization. So I don't really have like a, whatever happens in this team, in a sense, doesn't affect how good I'm doing in the organization. So they don't have to look good towards me, and they don't have to look bad towards me. They also sometimes immediately see me as somebody that they can trust not to tell everybody else about everything. So they tell me things that they wouldn't tell their manager or their team leader, or maybe even their colleagues sometimes. So in my experience, it's actually easier for the team to trust somebody who's an outsider. I have to say that the first time I see a team, every time I have to make this little speech that, of course, what I hear here, I won't say to anybody else, because this is what I do. And if word came out that I would talk about what happened at retrospectives, I would very quickly lose all my customers. Now, that being said, my whole book is written about things I've seen about retrospectives, but they're of course completely anonymized, and people have changed gender or age in this book. So I think they won't be able to recognize themselves, and they definitely will not be able to recognize other people. But it is interesting, but it works.
Yeah, excellent. Very good answer. Thank you. And then this is a good one. How can you reboot your retrospective with a team who feels they aren't necessary? So what's the first step to get them back on track and understand the purpose for a retrospective?
Yeah. Again, you have to go back to the why. I mean, retrospectives are not necessary in themselves. Learning is necessary. Team building is necessary. Improving as a team is necessary. So that's what you have to go back to. And then perhaps you need to do it in a different way than you normally did. And perhaps you as a facilitator can say, right, well, I've noticed that you haven't felt that you got so much out of these retrospectives, but I've searched and I've found a way to do this, which I think will bring us more value. And then you have to be very, very prepared to every step and every activity you do with them. You have to tell them, why do I do this? So for instance, you have to have everybody say something in the beginning. You say, the reason why I make everybody say something in the beginning is every time people come to a new meeting, they have a sort of brain residue from an earlier meeting, and we want to get rid of that brain residue so that you think about this meeting instead of what you just noticed or what your wife just told you. And the other reason is that if you allow people to be silent in the beginning, then they're more likely to become silent the rest of the retrospective. So that was just an example. But what I mean is that for everything you do, you have to explain people why you do it and what you expect them to get out of it. Because if you just say, right now we all have to stand in a circle and hold hands, and they just said, that's ridiculous. Or always talk about what you had for breakfast, or describe the last sprint as a weather forecast. This is a waste of time. And then for every activity, debrief, say, so what we got out of this was we understood this. And then keep it sharp, get rid of the small talk, make sure that they feel that something is happening all the time. And perhaps make them talk 2 and 2 instead of in plenum, because in plenum, so it's a prime directive for retrospectives in a sense, right? You have to appreciate that the retrospective is also doing the best it can. So if you don't believe the retrospectives will help you, you will start sitting with your phone or with your computer or doing something else. And if you don't enter into the retrospective, then it will be a waste of time. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm running out of English now, sorry. So everybody has to be active to some extent all the time if you have that problem. So you can't speak in plenum. They have to speak 2 and 2 in breakout rooms, or 2 and 2 in pairs in the room. Or they have to write something, and you have to be able to see who's writing so that you can see they're all writing something. And then you can maybe chat directly to people who are not writing and ask them, have you run out of things to say, or something like that.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you for that. All right, next question. I'm wondering about the refactored solution for disregard of preparation. Is this really addressing the root cause? If the people on a Scrum team forget about a regular meeting, there seems to be something else going on. So maybe can you talk to a little bit the disregard of preparation?
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right. Of course, you can always think about, are you just solving the symptoms here? Are you solving the actual problem? So am I myself doing what I said you shouldn't do? Well, it depends, right? If they recurringly forget that meeting, then of course it's a bad sign. It's a sign that they don't get anything out of it. But in my experience with the online meetings, it's a bit more difficult for people to remember that recurring meeting, because they're not together and they're not talking about it over lunch, and they're not reminded about other people getting up. So I think it's a bit different. But I hear what you say, that if people continue to be late to the meeting, maybe there's something else. Maybe it's a sign that they don't respect the meeting and they don't think they get something out of it. Definitely.
Awesome. All right, we have time. Let's slip in one more and we'll wrap up, try to be right on time. So we record our retrospective actions very well, but find that we're often addressing the same problem fixes in every retro. What would you recommend for keeping changes front and center for the team until the items are addressed?
Make sure first that the problem you're solving is a problem and not just a symptom of the problem. Second, try a different way of having a retrospective. Try a futurespective, you can look it up, or a positivity retrospective, you can look it up. Try one of those online things and see if it makes it more fun for people to do it like that, or try a different facilitator.
Ooh, I like that. Mix it up a little bit. Throw a little bit of a spice in there.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, that is right at our time. I heard that beep and it's spot on time. I know this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your great input. And again, thank you to everyone who joined and asked all of our questions. We have a lot of other questions we might maybe see if we can get you to answer offline or something. But again, highly recommend the book. Retrospective Antipatterns comes out in November. Is that right?
Yeah, it comes out in America on November 2nd, and I think it'll be in Europe in December.
Oh.
So if you're in America, you're lucky.
Wonderful.
But you can already pre-order it.
Yeah, we get the early version.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Aino, and also for Agile Alliance and Retrium for sponsoring this. We really do appreciate everyone who participated in this webinar today. We had great attendance. Thank you again for all the questions and the great chat. And everybody, we're going to let you go until our next webinar that we have on retrospectives. I'm Isaac Garcia from Retrium signing off. Everyone have a great rest of your day, wherever you are in the world. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for your time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.